In an old alley with worn stones, in the Jerusalem of yesteryear, there is an almost palpable atmosphere of mystery and reverence. It is in this sacred place, amidst historic walls that have witnessed battles, promises, and hopes, that our narrative about the transformative power of God begins. In this city where faith and history intertwine, troubled hearts seek answers to spiritual enigmas that have spanned centuries. Among the narrow streets and markets where the aroma of spices blends with the merchant's chants, there is a sense that a new movement of the Spirit is about to emerge. As pilgrims from all corners of the world gather to pray, a few, perhaps chosen or simply more attentive, perceive that the sacred scriptures carry more than doctrines and traditions. There are keys to liberation, power, and mental transformation. After all, the Apostle Paul already warned, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may discern what is the good, pleasing, and perfect will of God." Romans 12:2. And it is precisely this renewal of the mind that emerges as the central theme on every corner, in every prayerful sigh, in every glimpse of hope. At the doors of synagogues, rabbis teach ancient passages of the scriptures, while in secret rooms scholars delve over dusty scrolls in a quest to decipher still hidden theological mysteries. Symbolisms and prophecies intertwine, revealing that the voice of God continues to echo through the ages, transforming destinies and inviting men and women to align themselves with divine truth. What few understand, however, is that this voice echoes above all within hearts open to receive it. Amid the crowd of faithful and curious people roaming the city, there are unique individuals who feel led to an inner journey. Something stirs within them, a subtle call to explore the unknown dimensions of the mind, where God can speak more clearly and deeply. It is in this intimate search that the certainty arises that thoughts aligned with divine will have the power to shape realities, redirect lives, and rewrite stories. In this sacred and secret-filled setting, our story begins. Here past and present merge, revelations emerge from ancient pages, and the mind renewed by the Holy Spirit can become the greatest instrument of transformation. It is time to dive into the biblical enigmas that point to the power of God, a power that speaks, heals, and transforms. In the early hours of a bright morning in Jerusalem, when the sky tinged with gold announces the dawn, three figures stand out among the travelers moving through the ancient streets. They are pilgrims who surprisingly share the same longing to understand how thoughts can transform one's own life and thus discover the fullness of God's power. Each carries in their heart a personal enigma, a question whose answer seems buried in hidden scrolls or in the divine voice that whispers to the spirit. Nomi is a young woman with a serene face and penetrating eyes, carrying a family heritage of deep devotion. Daughter of a scribe who dedicated his life to studying the scriptures, she grew up surrounded by accounts of miracles and prophecies. From childhood, she was fascinated by how often God seemed to speak through the thoughts of his servants, guiding them in crucial moments. Now an adult, she feels a burning desire to better understand this mystery. How can the renewed mind reflect the very voice of God? However, behind her faith lies a longing for healing. She suffers from recurring memories of past losses. Fear and insecurity cloud her mind, so that sometimes she doubts her ability to hear God clearly. Still, she is driven by an intense search for answers, believing that the renewal of the mind is not mere theory but a real path to liberation and transformation. Further ahead, attentively observing the stone walls of an ancient synagogue, is Azarias. He is a middle-aged man marked by scars from both literal and spiritual battles. He grew up amidst the political and religious tensions of the region and, from a young age, dreamed of being a soldier to defend Jerusalem. However, the harshness of the conflicts led him to question God's goodness. Carrying war traumas and disappointments, Azarias became deeply involved in the study of the scriptures. Contradictory, he is both skeptical and fascinated by theological mysteries. He seeks solid evidence that God still speaks to men, especially through the mind and thoughts. In his heart, there is a dilemma. If this mental renewal truly exists, why do so many wars and sufferings persist? In this paradox, he clings to the hope that by unraveling biblical enigmas, he will find an answer for the restoration of his own soul. Lastly, there is Eliab, a young man learning the rabbi's trades. He grew up studying scrolls and dedicated his life to understanding every nuance of the laws and traditions. He has genuine zeal for the sacred text, striving to fulfill every commandment. However, deep in his heart, he feels the lack of an essential element, the true experience of walking with God in intimacy. For him, renewing the mind means transcending the cold letter of the law and diving into a living relationship where the divine voice manifests both externally and within oneself. Eliabe realizes that there is a distance between what he has memorized his entire life and the simplicity of hearing the Creator directly in his spirit. Therefore, as he walks through Jerusalem's alleys, he carries with him a partially damaged scroll that he found in the archives of an ancient master. This text suggests that as man aligns his thoughts with those of God, he discovers answers capable of changing the course of personal destiny, and possibly all of humanity. Nomi, Azarias, and Eliabe do not know each other yet, but they are about to unite on a journey as mysterious as it is challenging. In a way that only the Holy Spirit could orchestrate, the paths of these three will converge at the same point: the discovery that God speaks to the hearts of those who seek, and that the mind can become a sanctuary where the Creator reveals deep directions and purposes. Among ancient books, conversations with elders, and testimonies left by patriarchs of faith, a common enigma arises. Certain passages of the Scriptures seem to point to a transformation that is not merely ritualistic or behavioral, but mental. How to practically translate the commandment of Romans 12:2, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." Beyond theory, these characters seek the real experience of divine power, believing that if the mind is renewed, the entire life will be restructured according to God's plan. However, it is not a simple quest. External voices, from culture, fear, pessimism, try to silence the inner voice that whispers eternal truths. Throughout Jerusalem, whispers indicate that a spiritual cloak of doubt is hanging over many people. There are those who no longer believe in the possibility of miracles, who question whether God truly cares about human dilemmas. Some more traditional rabbis censor any interpretation of the Scriptures that goes beyond the literal, while others believe in a more mystical and personal encounter with the eternal. It is in this environment of contrasts that Nomi, Azarias, and Eliabe face their initial dilemmas. She, struggling against the pain of the past; he, skeptical yet full of hope to overcome his traumas; and the young student, aware that knowledge of the law alone does not satisfy but yearns for a transformative experience. Feeling a subtle yet powerful inclination to dive into this call, to understand how God speaks to the spirit and renews the mind, each realizes that this journey promises to shake internal structures and possibly rewrite destinies. What will they find by combining millennia-old biblical passages with the reality of their present conflicts? What is the key that unlocks the mind so that the voice of the Most High can be heard clearly? While the stone synagogue seems to silently observe this quest, an old wise man murmurs a forgotten truth: lasting change does not come from outside, but from within. It is in thought that the battle begins, and it is there that the voice of God triumphs, transforming everything around. Thus, each carries unanswered questions in their hearts, which can only be solved if they dare to explore the path of the theological mysteries that unfold before them. Little do they know that, upon meeting, these individual longings will form a much larger puzzle, a map pointing to the renewal of the mind as the path to fully experiencing the power and presence of God. The sun had already reached its zenith when Nomi, Azarias, and Eliabe, each guided by a unique intuition, converged at the central courtyard of an ancient inn located near the western wall. At first, they did not notice the forces connecting them in that place, but it was as if a sudden familiarity filled the air. Amid the murmuring prayers of pilgrims and the distant chanting of psalms, their eyes met. The unexpected encounter. Nomi carried a small basket with scrolls she had inherited from her father, the scribe. She needed a quiet place to study them and, perhaps, find the relief she so desperately sought for her inquietudes. Azarias was looking for a refuge where he could, for a few hours, silence the internal voices that threw him back to scenes of past battles. In his pocket, he kept a fragment of a manuscript found on the battlefield, containing a quote from the prophet Isaiah: "You, Lord, will keep in perfect peace those whose minds are steadfast, because they trust in you." Isaiah 26:3. Eliabe had come there in search of an elderly man known for his wisdom in the Scriptures. He wanted to inquire about the damaged scroll he carried. In the face of a stone well in the center of the courtyard, facing a stone well in the center of the courtyard, they first saw each other as strangers, but a brief greeting was enough to spark that moment of recognition that only the Holy Spirit could instill. Nomi, noticing that Eliabe held a partially torn scroll, approached cautiously, curious to understand the nature of those ancient writings. Azarias, spotting the Hebrew words, came closer to try to decipher them. In a few moments, a timid conversation began, revealing that despite their different paths, they were all seeking something beyond the tangible, the key to transforming the mind and, consequently, their own lives. Initial theological conflict. It was then that tension arose. Azarias, still perplexed by the brutality of the world, questioned whether renewing the mind would truly be enough to transform realities as harsh as war. "I've seen horrible things," he confessed, his eyes fixed on a distant point. "How can just changing the way we think prevent calamities from happening?" Eliabe, in turn, pointed to the scriptures he was studying. The laws of Moses and the writings of the prophets speak of a heart converted to God, but there are passages that go beyond, suggesting that our thoughts need to be shaped by the eternal. I believe that when a man accepts God's thoughts, something changes on the spiritual plane. Nomi, silently flipping through one of her father's scrolls, where he related Romans 12:2 to Psalm 139, which mentions how God searches and knows the human mind. She ventured, maybe it's not just about changing thoughts for the sake of change, but allowing God to write a law of love, faith, and hope within us. It is He who transforms. However, Azarias maintained an incredulous expression. "I understand what you're saying, but I need to see how this works in practice. What's the point of seeking a mental change if, when I leave here, my fears and memories still haunt me?" Symbolic discoveries. At that moment, an elderly figure appeared, walking with calm steps. It was the man Eliabe had come to seek, a seasoned master named Simeon. With deep eyes, he began to listen to them. Noticing their doubts, Simeon invited the three to follow a narrow alleyway that led to an ancient study room. There, scattered on wooden shelves, lay rare manuscripts with reflections on seemingly forgotten passages. Among the scrolls, there was one in particular that mentioned the story of Elijah, when the prophet experienced the wind, the earthquake, and the fire, but the voice of God was manifested in the gentle whisper. 1 Kings 19:12. Simeon explained tenderly, "The mind often stirs with noise and disorder, but in serenity we find the channel to hear the voice of the Most High. And if we learn to silence the turbulences, we can experience the transformative power of that whisper." As they flipped through the scroll, Eliabe saw a passage related to 2 Corinthians 10:4-5, where the Apostle Paul speaks about taking every thought captive to obey Christ. He read aloud, impressed by the connotation of spiritual struggle the text suggested. "Maybe there is indeed an internal battle, and we need to arm ourselves not with swords or spears, but with the truth of God planted in our minds," he commented, casting a hopeful glance at Azarias. The symbol of the smooth stone. Simeon stood up and picked up a small smooth stone from a container on the shelf. "Do you see this stone?" he asked, holding it up to the eye level of the young men. It was once rough, shapeless, but with time and work it was polished until it became smooth and useful. So it is the human mind, subject to storms, fears, and the marks that life imposes. But when we allow God to polish it, removing edges and smoothing layers, it can become a reflection of divine will. Nomi, moved, remembered a passage her father liked to quote, "He will remove your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh." Ezekiel 36:26. However, now the reference from Ezekiel seemed to take on an even deeper meaning, as it wasn't just the heart that needed renewal, but also the mind, the place where thoughts circulate that can imprison or liberate. The call to depth, impressed by Simeon's clear words, the three understood that they had found not just a mentor, but a guardian of spiritual secrets. Through symbolism, the master showed that biblical discoveries are not mere theories. They are invitations to experience. And in that invitation, there is always a challenge, to allow the Spirit of God to confront limiting beliefs and, in renewing the mind, reveal unimaginable possibilities. Azarias, still skeptical, began to reflect. He remembered prayers he had made during the darkest days of the war, asking God to deliver him from fear. In that instant, he realized that perhaps the true miracle was not the absence of external conflicts, but the inner peace that is established even amidst storms, a peace born from a mind confident in the goodness and sovereignty of the Most High. "What if the answer was always within my reach?" he whispered, lowering his eyes. "What if, in fact, my thoughts could be aligned with the voice of God and thus give me the strength to face any situation?" New awareness and uncertainties. The conversation with Simeon illuminated principles that Nomi, Azarias, and Eliaba had never considered so deeply before. Still, each harbored internal questions that made the journey uncertain. Nomi wondered if she would have the strength to abandon the painful memories of the past and finally embrace the promised mental freedom. Azarias, for his part, questioned to what extent he could trust this divine voice and let go of the control he had always tried to exert over circumstances. Eliaba, eager to put all this theory into practice, wished to see concrete signs that God speaks, and that by renewing the mind, everything around could gain a new perspective. With a gentle smile, Simeon concluded, "Now that you have discovered this door, you must walk through it. Remember that renewing the mind is a process, but it is in this process that God reveals His greatness. Open yourselves to His voice. Let your thoughts be transformed, and you will see the power of the Most High guiding every step." The three exchanged looks filled with expectation. Within those silent walls, the conviction emerged that the journey had only just begun. The theological tension still hung in the air, but it was accompanied by a flicker of pulsating faith. They knew that from that point on, the path would be both internal and external, involving conflicts, discoveries, and likely twists, all against the backdrop of a God who speaks and whose voice echoes, especially in the mind that allows itself to be renewed. The sun was setting over Jerusalem, cloaking the city in orange hues that blended with the growing shadows of the ancient buildings. As they left Simeon's study room, Nomi, Azarias, and Eliaba felt the weight of hours of conversation and reflection. Each carried within them a seed of hope, planted by the Master's words, but also the unease of those who realize they are about to uncover something greater than they had imagined. The inn's courtyard, now lit by lamplights, was the stage for murmurs of prayer and the hurried footsteps of other pilgrims, signs of a greater mystery. The atmosphere seemed to carry a different mystique that night. A gentle breeze blew, as if inviting them to stay alert for what was to come. As they settled into a corner of the courtyard to rest, Nomi took out one of the manuscripts from her basket. She held it with a certain tremor in her hands. It was a text her father always mentioned, but which she herself had never fully deciphered. It was a collection of notes on biblical passages that related mind, heart, and spirit, and how God communicated through them. Azarias, still impacted by Simeon's observations, approached curiously. "Do you believe there might be a specific indication, something that illuminates the path to this renewal of thought that we so seek?" he asked, observing how the ancient letters aligned. Nomi let out a soft sigh. "I believe so. My father talked about a rare text that, when found and correctly interpreted, would reveal an ancient promise about the purified mind connected to God. I don't know yet if this scroll contains such information, but I feel that something here could be the key." The hidden word Eliabe, accustomed to handling sacred texts, took the initiative to read each line of the manuscript calmly. At first it seemed like just a compilation of known verses, psalms that exalt the Lord's law, excerpts from the prophets that speak about the human heart and its inclination to err, as well as passages from the Pentateuch emphasizing obedience to the Most High. However, upon turning another page, they encountered unusual symbols, as if they were codes or acrostics. Nomi explained that her father believed these symbols functioned as hints, clues left by scribes centuries ago to guide scholars toward hidden truths. "My father said that, out of fear of persecution, some rabbis and Jewish mystics hid secret messages in the writings, believing that only those moved by a true desire to know God could decipher them," she explained, her voice filled with longing. The revelation of the scroll. As they analyzed the characters, Eliaba commented that they resembled a mix of classical Hebrew and an encrypted alphabet that some Essenes might have used during the Second Temple period. Azarias, who was not an expert in ancient scripts, observed their expressiveness. He felt his heart race as if something great was about to unfold. Little did he realize that this excitement signaled a first hint of inner change, the usual skepticism beginning to give way to a sense of expectation and openness to the supernatural. It was then that Eliab noticed a curious pattern. Amidst the usual words, a term with 3 Hebrew consonants repeatedly appeared that could mean mind, heart, or thought. Depending on the vowel added in the middle, the meaning changed. "This is the key," he exclaimed. "There is a correlation here between the human mind and the mind of God." With Nomi's help, he managed to decode a small phrase that, translated freely, said, "In the purified mind, the Eternal inscribes his ways and his promises." Although short, this phrase shimmered with the strength of an ancient prophecy, pointing to a spiritual reality in which God would communicate directly through thought, transforming destinies. The first turn. As they shared the discovery, a strong wind invaded the courtyard, almost extinguishing the lanterns. Pilgrims ran to protect themselves from the sand being brought by the gusts. Nomi and Eliab protected the manuscript, and Azarias instinctively placed himself in front, as if wishing to defend them. Suddenly, a startling snap echoed, as if something had broken. In the keen eyes of the trio, the figure of an elderly man appeared, wearing simple clothes, but notably worn by time. His eyes gleamed in the dimness, and there was an air of urgency about him. He approached, slightly staggering, as if he had been pushed by the wind to that spot. "Forgive my intrusion," he murmured with a hoarse voice. "But I heard you reading something that hasn't been heard since I was a young apprentice. May I see the scroll?" There was some hesitation. Who could he be? A follower of Simeon? A spy wanting the revelations for his own use? Finally, Nomi opened the small scroll in a way that allowed him to see the decoded passage. The elder could barely contain his emotion when he realized the meaning of the prominent letters. With tears in his eyes, he let out, "I have traveled through many lands in search of this fragment. They say that whoever truly understands these words will experience direct communion with the voice of God." The connecting thread of prophecies. From this unexpected appearance, the trio found themselves facing a new enigma. How did this man even know about the text? And why did he seem so desperate to confirm its authenticity? He then introduced himself as Abner, a former student of renowned rabbis who decades ago came across legends about an oracle of the renewed mind. According to such legends, whoever could fully decipher the message contained in certain hidden passages would empower themselves and their people to a new dimension of understanding. Abner narrated that many came before him, but gave up along the way, either out of fear or lack of commitment. Some rabbis abandoned the search due to political pressures and threats from authorities, who feared that such discoveries could inflame the people with ideas that escaped the strictly orthodox religious control. Others simply succumbed to skepticism. "I heard that a famous scribe guarded this manuscript," Abner continued, casting a respectful glance at Nomi. "But I never imagined that his daughter would be willing to continue the mission." Azarias, listening attentively, felt a chill run down his spine. It was as if the pieces of a great puzzle were starting to fit together. Eliab, in turn, recalled Simeon's words about the whisper of God amidst the noise. Could this promise not be there for everyone? Wouldn't the ultimate purpose of the scriptures be to make God's voice accessible, completely transforming our understanding? The young man questioned. The message takes shape. For Abner, however, the issue was even deeper. If this fragment really speaks of a reality in which the mind aligns with the Creator, then there are enormous implications. Everything that happens around a person whose mind is guided by God transforms. Lives can be healed, destinies can be shaped. It is the very fulfillment of Jeremiah 31:33, when the Lord says he will put his law within his people and write it on their hearts. At that moment, a reverent silence fell over the group. Even Azarias, who was immersed in internal conflicts, could glimpse a flicker of faith. Could it be that he had finally found the answer to the fears that haunted him? Was the renewal of the mind the key to lasting peace, even amidst the battles of the world? A path with no return. They didn't know for sure what steps to take next, but one thing was clear. This was the first twist of many. They had found a small portion of a greater truth, a map that, if followed, could lead them to the heart of the divine plan. But, like all precious discoveries, it also brought risks and would require more than mere curiosity. It required surrender, faith, and above all courage to face the voices that would rise against them. After all, the mysteries of the Most High often confront both reason and religious and cultural structures. As the night advanced, Nomi, Azarias, Eliabe, and the newcomer Abner gathered to pray, joining hands and hearts. Under the stars that seemed to twinkle with unusual intensity, they asked for clarity and protection from the God who had opened that portal of knowledge to them. One could feel in the air the first breath of a radical change in each of their lives, and, who knows, in all of Jerusalem. Under the soft light of the lanterns at the inn, the group, now formed by Nomi, Azarias, Eliabe, and Abner, gathered in a corner where they could talk without interruptions. Still dominated by the fascination of discovering a possible oracle of the renewed mind, they spent the night exchanging perceptions and concerns. It was a decisive moment. What to do with that knowledge and how to put it into practice. Nomi's unease. No sooner had the sun begun to rise on the horizon than Nomi felt her mind bubbling with questions. She had spent the night mentally reviewing the memories of her father, the scribe. Since she was little, she had heard him tell stories about people who experienced the voice of God in surprising ways. Now that she seemed to have in her hands a fragment that could explain how this voice acts in the mind, she found herself torn between hope and fear. Hope manifested in the prospect of finally freeing herself from the painful memories that tormented her. Fear, in turn, reminded her that deep revelations often generate resistance and even persecution. What if others want to prevent us from understanding these truths? Am I prepared to deal with opposition? She wondered, while her heart pounded. Still, recalling Abner's words about the fulfillment of Jeremiah 31:33, when God writes his law within people, Nomi felt a breeze of peace settle in her innermost being. Perhaps it was the first sign that her fears were losing strength in the face of a greater truth. Azarias' dilemma. As for Azarias, in silence, he watched the wind shaking the canvas of the surrounding tents. He was consumed by a mix of fascination and skepticism. On the one hand, he longed for the text about the renewed mind to be true, as he wished to find relief from his war traumas. On the other hand, he couldn't simply turn off the ghosts of the past that robbed him of peace. I still feel guilty for having taken up arms and seen so much destruction, he confessed finally to the others. When night falls, my thoughts become a true battlefield. But if this scroll is real, if God can really inscribe his ways on our minds, maybe I can find the courage and peace I've always sought. Abner, with a serene voice, replied, "Perhaps the forgiveness you so desperately seek is available, Azarias. The mind is not just a receptacle of ideas. It reflects our inner state. When the Eternal reaches us, he can indeed cleanse the impurities of the past." The elder's words sounded like a balm, but also posed a challenge. Would Azarias be able to open himself to divine forgiveness, and above all, to self-forgiveness? Eliabe, knowledge versus experience. Eliabe, sitting on the ground with his legs crossed, leafed through the decoded scroll again. As someone dedicated to study and doctrine, his entire life had been built upon the formal knowledge of the scriptures. However, he now faced an internal tension. Everything indicated that this power of the renewed mind was not limited to reading texts and applying laws, but involved a personal and transformative experience. He remembered the lessons of an ancient rabbi who said, "It is useless to read without seeking to live. It is useless to know if there is no love." This phrase echoed in his soul, making him realize that, to access the mystery contained in the scroll, he would have to lower the defenses of erudition and allow himself to experience the supernatural. Am I ready for this? To set aside the posture of a mere scholar and venture into a deep experience with God, he wondered. A flash of enthusiasm invaded him when he visualized the possibilities that would open up if that knowledge were applied in his life. Perhaps the greatest challenge is to unlearn some things to learn directly from the Spirit, he concluded, pressing the scroll against his chest. Abner's concern. Abner, for his part, was concerned with the practical developments of all they had discovered. He knew stories of persecutors, both external and among the religious leadership themselves, who opposed any biblical interpretation considered bold or capable of changing the established order. This text can cause turmoil if it falls into the wrong hands, or if it is interpreted frivolously, and there are those who would use it to manipulate minds, not to free them, he warned. We need wisdom to guide every step, for God never forces anyone to follow him. He invites. The true renewal of the mind does not come by force but by love and faith. Discussion about next steps. After sharing their concerns, the four began to discuss what to do next. There was the possibility of consulting their master Simeon again, who possessed vast wisdom in ancient texts, and perhaps could validate or further elucidate the encoded writing. They also considered the idea of visiting historical places in Jerusalem, where, according to Abner, there might still be additional clues about the practical application of this promise. Amid the possibilities, the question of cost arose. Whatever the next step was, they would have to put their own faith to the test. They would leave their comfort zones to face criticism, suspicious looks, and possibly threats. Each one, in their own way, felt the weight of a calling that could no longer be ignored. The silent voice of God. As they debated, a strange quietude took over the environment. For a moment, everyone fell silent, feeling as if God himself were present in a tangible way, blowing a touch of serenity. It was Nomi who broke the silence. "Do you feel that? It's as if we are surrounded by a peace that surpasses all understanding." Azarias nodded, allowing a solitary tear to roll down his face. Perhaps it was the first time in years that he felt his heart calm. Eliaba noticed how his skepticism was diminishing, replaced by a reverence that words couldn't explain. Abner, for his part, smiled emotionally, recognizing that subtle movement of the spirit, so rare and so striking. In that moment, they realized that each of them was reacting, in their own way, to something divine that was already in action. The renewal of the mind seemed not just a distant concept, but a reality that was beginning to operate, little by little, within them. Concluding the moment. At the end of that morning, they decided that the first step would be to return to Simeon. He needed to know about the revelations they had found in Nomi's manuscript and possibly contribute his experience so they could proceed. With their hearts warmed by God's presence, they gathered their few belongings and set off. They walked side by side along the cobblestone streets, feeling a mix of excitement and trembling at what was to come. After all, everything indicated that this knowledge about the renewed mind was not just theory, but implied a call to practice, and the practice, in turn, would transform the way each of them viewed life, personal dilemmas, and even the surrounding spiritual structures. Among knowing glances and silent prayers, they understood that God's calling resonated in both small and large choices. By opening their hearts to the touch of the eternal, their entire inner dynamics seemed to change. And if the mind began to be shaped, then power and destiny would come to be influenced by the Creator's voice. From that point on, nothing would be the same. The path toward true renewal of the mind was unfolding, and at the same time, it was filling with new challenges. But uncertainties mattered little. Deep down, each one already sensed that the God who spoke through the Scriptures would continue to guide them with love and authority. The afternoon in Jerusalem brought with it a gentle warmth as the group returned to the cobblestone streets to meet Simeon again. The constant murmur of voices, vendors, pilgrims, children, mingled with the sense of expectation rising within each of them. As they approached the master's small study house, the spiritual questions became increasingly urgent, almost palpable. After all, what would they discover this time? Arrival at Simeon's house. As they passed through the worn wooden door, they found Simeon sitting in silence, his eyes closed in meditation. Despite seeming absorbed, he opened his usual gentle smile upon noticing the group's presence. "Let us then return to this quest for the renewed mind," he said in a welcoming tone, inviting them to settle around a simple stone table. Emerging new questions. Nomi, taking the initiative, handed the decoded scroll to the master, presenting the recent discoveries. Simeon frowned, examining each symbol and annotation in detail. His silence showed concentration, but also something more, a reverent respect for the hidden truths in those letters. When he looked up, they noticed a flash of concern. "Are you aware that this profound truth about God's power in our mind may not be well received by everyone?" he questioned, his voice sounding almost prophetic. "Some will fear it, as it threatens the comfort of old and institutional beliefs. Others will desire this knowledge for selfish purposes, and there are those who will deny everything out of fear of embracing a living faith." Simeon's observation brought up questions they would have preferred not to face at that moment. Eliaba swallowed hard, recognizing that in his traditional upbringing, such an intimate communion with God, one that could transform every thought, was rarely discussed. So, where is the line between genuine pursuit and fanaticism? Is it possible that, in the eagerness to find the divine voice in our mind, we might end up lost in our own illusions? He asked, sharing a fear that weighed on his heart. Doubts about God's will. Azarias, for his part, recalled the battle scenes that invaded his mind every night. What if, in the end, what I hear as the voice of God is just a projection of my traumas? If I convince myself of something that God is not actually saying, I might be mistaken or hurt others. How can we be sure that we are in fact listening to the eternal? That was a valid fear, and in a way, common to those yearning for a genuine spiritual experience. The idea of confusing one's own inner voice with the divine voice cast a shadow of doubt. Was the renewal of the mind a safe process, or something that would require constant testing in the light of the scriptures? Noemi's internal conflict. While the men discussed, Naomi remained introspective, her fingers brushing the edge of an old scroll that had belonged to her father. She was restless. On one hand, she felt her heart inflame with faith at the prospect of finding healing for the wounds she carried. On the other hand, she feared that her desire for emotional comfort might blind her to God's will. Is there any kind of sign that indicates our mind is being purified by the Creator himself and not shaped by our selfish desires? She asked, attempting to verbalize her fear. Simeon responds, spiritual discernment. The master nodded, making it clear that he understood each one's hesitations. The scriptures teach us to test the spirits to see if they are from God, 1 John 4:1. This also applies to the inspirations that arise in our own minds. A renewed mind aligns with the Word. If what we think contradicts the essence of divine love, compassion, and justice present in the scriptures, we are likely facing an illusion. He paused for a moment, quickly flipped through a passage from the prophet Isaiah and continued, Remember, God does not contradict himself. His will is consistent with the character revealed throughout the Bible. Thus, the first indicator that the mind is in tune with him is the manifestation of the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, faithfulness. Quoting Galatians 5:22-23. A new dimension of faith. Challenges. From these explanations, the group encountered a deeper level of challenges. It was not enough to seek to hear God mentally. It was necessary to subject each thought to verification in the Word, as well as to the scrutiny of the divine character. This, while providing direction, required responsibility. It was not a matter of hearing voices, but of cultivating a relationship with the Most High that involved prayer, Bible reading, and constant discernment. Abner, who had been silent until then, took the opportunity to share a case he had experienced some time ago. I knew a man who proclaimed to have received a divine revelation to lead a rebellious group. He spoke of holy war and vengeance, but his heart was full of hatred. He used Bible passages out of context to justify his actions. In the end, he found himself entangled in contradictions, and the result was tragedy. He lost his way from the true God because he did not test his own thoughts in light of the scriptures. Abner's account reinforced the need for prudence. Azarias, hearing this, felt a shiver. The line separating a mind aligned with God and a mind corrupted by human passions seemed thin. So the renewal of the mind is not an instantaneous act, but a process of daily submission to the divine will, he concluded in a calmer voice, as if by acknowledging this fact, he had found a safe path to walk. The growing tension. In light of these reflections, a tension hung in the air. Each one realized that to proceed they would have to confront their own vulnerability. Azarias' skepticism, Eliabe's need for control, Naomi's fears, and Abner's awareness of the dangers of exposing spiritual secrets, all these elements began to converge into a single faith challenge. After all, if the divine voice speaks internally, there is also the risk of resisting it when it confronts comfortable areas of life. And if the renewal of the mind implies renouncing old patterns, toxic relationships, or even dreams that do not reflect God's will, the price of obedience is usually high, Simeon pointed out, lightly touching the decoded scroll. But the reward of walking in the light of the eternal is incomparably greater. Comfort in the promise. Before concluding, Simeon led the group in a simple prayer. Under the dimness of the room, with the fleeting daylight of the evening entering through the door, they bowed their heads, asking for wisdom and humility. Each one presented their questions before God, assuming that they would only continue forward if he himself sustained the search. For a moment they felt a singular sweetness, almost as if the heavens were smiling upon them. Rising with renewed strength, They looked into each other's eyes and realized that no matter the faith challenges, this path seemed inevitable. The renewed mind was not just a theory, it was emerging as a living, pulsating reality. Seeing and living this reality, however, would require facing internal and external pressures. There would be doubts, oppositions, and perhaps pain. But there was also the promise that by tuning their thoughts to God's voice, each step would find purpose. And in the end, the transformed mind would become an instrument of healing for themselves and for those who crossed their path. The night descended on the city. Night was falling over the city, bringing a brief relief from the day's heat and painting the skies in violet hues. After praying alongside Simeon, Naomi, Azarias, Eliab, and Abner left in silence, each carrying a whirlwind of thoughts. The quest for a renewed mind, though filled with hope, was beginning to reveal deep emotional challenges. It was as if the light of divine truth illuminated forgotten areas of the heart, exposing fears, insecurities, and hidden ambitions. The weight of responsibility. As they walked down a narrow alley with uneven stones beneath their feet, Eliab couldn't suppress a heavy sigh. He had always imagined that studying the scriptures would provide clear answers to all human questions. However, the deeper he delved, the more he realized how much the word pointed to an inner transformation that required courage. The Mosaic law that I so love served as a guide for the people of Israel, but now I feel that God's calling goes beyond the norms, he confided, his eyes lowered. It's as if I have to abandon the security of ready-made interpretations and embrace a real intimacy with the eternal. Abner nodded in agreement, reminding him of Jeremiah 29:13, where God says, "You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart." The journey of knowledge, Eliab, is important, but the renewal of the mind requires a heart that lays bare before God, and that often places us in front of our own contradictions. Azarias' wounds and fears. While Eliab's challenge was to let go of intellectual control, for Azarias, the greatest obstacle was healing the scars left by the conflicts he had witnessed. In his mind, memories of battlefields, screams, and fear emerged like disturbing echoes. "I feel unworthy of hearing God so closely," he murmured, his voice choked. "How can he want to transform my mind if all I remember is destruction?" Naomi gently touched his shoulder. "We all carry wounds, Azarias, but God does not disdain a broken heart." Psalm 51:17. He knows our struggles and still calls us to draw near to him. Think of the Apostle Paul, who persecuted Christians before becoming one of the greatest proclaimers of the gospel. If God restored him, he can restore anyone. Naomi's words comforted him for a moment. However, the fear that renewing the mind might not be enough to erase the traumas began to haunt him again. It revealed an internal conflict, the desire to believe in God's unconditional love versus the weight of the past. Naomi and the struggle against guilt. Naomi, while strengthening the others, faced her own shadows. She recalled the family tragedies that shook her faith, and the guilt she secretly felt for not doing more to prevent certain events. She always wondered if the pain she felt was a form of punishment, or if she could find, through the renewal of the mind, a path to liberation. "I wonder, why did God allow my family to go through so many losses?" she confided, her hands trembling as she held the basket of scrolls. "Can my mind see beyond the suffering and understand a greater purpose?" Abner, experienced in dealing with such questions, brought up the example of Joseph of Egypt, who was betrayed by his brothers and sold into slavery, but ultimately recognized that God had turned all that evil into good. Genesis 50:20. Sometimes it's only by looking back that we understand the threads the Creator wove for our good. But to see that, we need to allow Him to heal our inner vision. Abner's longing for truth. Despite his serene demeanor, Abner also carried intimate battles. He had dedicated much of his life to seeking forgotten texts and revealing secrets of the scriptures. Deep down, he feared not seeing the concrete fruit of his mission. "I spend sleepless nights wondering if all this effort will be worth it, and if in the end these discoveries are buried again by ignorance," he vented, head bowed. At that moment, Simeon, who had been accompanying them at a distance, silently approached. "So is my word that goes out from my mouth. It will not return to me empty, but will accomplish what I desire." Isaiah 55:11. Abner, God's truth does not depend on us to exist. However, He invites us to be part of His work. We don't need to carry the weight of the entire outcome. We just need to be faithful to what has been entrusted to us. Connection with biblical passages. Gathered at the door of a small synagogue, the group decided to pray again there. Doubt was a silent enemy, but each person's spirit, though shaken, was hungry for the divine presence. As they sang soft hymns, they recalled passages that gave them strength. Romans 8:28. We know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him. 2 Corinthians 12:9. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Psalm 46:10. Be still and know that I am God. Each verse seemed to fit the dilemmas they were experiencing, as if God himself was stitching the words to their hearts, reinforcing that the renewal of the mind does not dispense with pain and struggles, but transcends them to the point of re-meaning them. Encounter with human fragility. As prayer flowed, Azarias' expression softened. Nomi shed a few tears. Eliab offered a subtle smile, perhaps for the first time feeling the lightness of not needing to have all the answers. Abner watched the scene. His heart warmed, remembering when he was a young man thirsty for real experiences with the Creator. Simeon, sensing the atmosphere of surrender, opened a passage from Philippians 4:8. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, think about such things. Here lies one of the pillars to maintain a renewed mind, the Master emphasized. Besides seeking communion with God, we must intentionally meditate on what builds up, what brings us closer to the character of Christ. After this devotional, each felt that even amidst their own vulnerabilities there was a spark of hope. They didn't have all the answers yet, but they noticed that the very act of confronting emotional dilemmas shed light on the promise they were exploring. The mind can indeed be transformed by God's voice. In the air lingered the certainty that the journey would continue to demand surrender and faith. The challenges wouldn't disappear. On the contrary, they would likely increase. But there was a sense of unity among them, a conviction that divine truth would sustain them in times of crisis. Thus, aware that a higher power was guiding them, they decided to rest that night, trusting that tomorrow would bring new directions. As the night wind danced through the streets of Jerusalem, their hearts buzzed with the expectation that, even amidst doubts and conflicting emotions, the God who renews the mind would not leave them without answers. And each heartbeat reminded them that the Creator was writing, page by page, a redemptive story, both in their minds and in their destinies. The next morning, the first light of the sun reflected off the stone walls of Jerusalem the next morning, announcing another day of heat and pulsating spirituality. Noemi, Azarias, Eliab, and Abner had slept little, overtaken by the anticipation of what might happen next. Each, in their own way, battled the doubts emerging in their minds but also embraced the growing spark of faith. The emergence of rumors. Early in the morning, while having a modest breakfast at the inn, they began to hear muffled conversations about a rumor spreading through the city. It was said that an ancient manuscript, containing dangerous revelations, had been rediscovered. Although no one knew its exact content, whispers suggested that such a scroll could cause a rupture in how many understood the law and the prophets. "Does this have anything to do with us?" Nomi asked, her expression worried, almost without appetite. Azarias exchanged a tense look with Abner. "I fear so. It's no coincidence that these rumors are arising right now, after we've deciphered part of the text about the renewed mind. It might be that more conservative religious leaders see this discovery as a threat to the order." First signs of persecution. As the morning progressed, Nomi noticed that some suspicious glances were directed at the group, as if tracking their steps. When they walked towards Simeon's house, they were approached by a man in a dark tunic, his face partially covered by a linen veil. Without beating around the bush, he whispered, "You are meddling with ancient forces. I advise you to stop while you still can. Some secrets should not be revealed." Before they could question him, the man walked away, blending into the crowd. The message, however, was clear. There were people watching the group's movements, people who certainly did not wish for the spread of a teaching capable of changing how communication with God and the renewal of the mind were perceived. Simeon's concern upon arriving at Simeon's study room, they found him rummaging through scrolls. He seemed agitated. He looked up upon noticing the group's presence and, with an urgent expression, said, "I just learned from an acquaintance that more traditional rabbis are disturbed. Some fear that this oracle of the renewed mind opens doors to interpretations that stray from the literal. and that, according to them, could lead the people to heresies or rebellions. Eliabe, astonished, argued, "But what could be so threatening about discovering that God wants to transform our minds and speak to us personally? Shouldn't that strengthen people's faith?" Simeon gave a slight smile of understanding. "Yes, it should, but many fear the unknown. There are leaders who crave control over interpretations, and when something arises that exceeds their comfort zone, the initial reaction can be hostile. The shadow of opposition." Hearing these words, Azarias felt his muscles tense. The idea of facing resistance from religious leaders made him relive memories of confrontations and wars. However, he realized that this spiritual conflict might require more inner strength than any physical battle. Noemi, for her part, struggled against the urge to retreat. Her desire to see people liberated by the knowledge of God's power clashed with the fear of possible persecution. "Should we continue? What if we are labeled as rebels or even accused of blasphemy?" she questioned herself silently. New clues in the manuscript. Trying to calm tensions, Abner suggested they go back to analyzing the decoded parchment, hoping to find instructions that could guide them amid the growing strain. As they spread the scrolls across the table, they noticed symbols that had not yet been thoroughly studied. They seemed to be additional characters, perhaps written in the margins by the scribes. "Look at this," Abner said, pointing to a sequence of words whose meaning had not been explored before. "These characters form something that translates roughly as lamp for those who walk in darkness." Eliab immediately recalled Psalm 119:105, "Your word is a lamp for my feet, a light on my path." Carefully, he brought a lamp closer to observe better. Some letters apparently referenced passages about divine wisdom and discernment, while others seemed to refer to the power of the Holy Spirit that reveals God's secrets to the human heart. The spiritual intrigue deepens. Amid their studies, Simeon began sharing an old rumor circulating among the more mystical scholars. There was a mention in apocryphal texts about an anointing of understanding that would allow the people to break mental barriers and hear God's voice with renewed clarity, without the need for complex rituals or human intermediaries. He feared that this idea might be too radical for many of Jerusalem's leaders, who preferred to keep communion with God limited to traditional sacrifices and ceremonies. If this manuscript is indeed a confirmation of this anointing of understanding, we can expect strong reactions. Some will embrace the truth with joy, but others will fight it with all their might, fearing the loss of privileges and control. Warning of a direct threat. While they were studying, a young apprentice assisting Simeon entered, almost out of breath. "Master, I've just received a message from an influential rabbi. He urgently requests your presence in a public debate about these new teachings circulating in the city." The tension in the room increased. Debating publicly would mean immediately exposing everything they had discovered. What if it was misinterpreted, further inflaming opposition? Simeon gave a worried look to Noemi, Azarias, Eliabe, and Abner. "We need to discern whether it is safe and wise to attend." Fear versus courage. Noemi's anxiety intensified. She remembered stories where masters faithful to the word ended up defamed. On the other hand, she also thought of Daniel and his friends, who were brave in witnessing their faith even in enemy lands. Maybe God is opening a door for us to proclaim the truth. But what if we are misunderstood, and it all turns into a big confusion? Abner, looking at everyone, added, "When it comes to revealing secrets from on high, we need to pray and fast before acting. Remember Nehemiah. He only succeeded in rebuilding the walls because he sought God in every decision. We can't just react out of fear, we need to act in obedience." The decision approaches. With the invitation or summons to a public debate and the rumors intensifying, the group realized they had reached a turning point. Willing to share the truth about God's power to renew the mind could attract attention but also hostility. On the other hand, remaining silent would be like burying that spiritual treasure they could offer to people thirsty for hope. Azarias voiced the dilemma. "I don't want conflicts. But if this knowledge can free so many who suffer, is it right for us to stay silent out of fear?" Simeon, with his characteristic serenity, concluded, "Perhaps the debate is inevitable. The light of God may disturb those who prefer the darkness of ignorance. If we are called to speak, we need to trust that the Creator will give us the right words. However, don't be mistaken. This path will have a price. The shadow of the next step." Thus, the stage was set for escalating tension. On one side, those who embraced the liberating potential of a mind renewed by God's voice. On the other, the traditional and fearful faction that saw danger in any interpretation that broke secular molds. In the middle, a people anxious for direction, easily influenced by rumors and conspiracies. Gathered in prayer, everyone pleaded for discernment and courage to move forward. While the city buzzed outside, each felt deep down the omen that something great was approaching. A confrontation that would be not only doctrinal, but also spiritual. The gears of time seemed to turn toward a crucial moment when the renewal of the mind would be put to the test before the crowd, and deep in each heart, the certainty, God had not invited them onto this path to abandon them now. He who speaks in whispers to the Spirit would certainly manifest amidst the storms generated by this knowledge, capable of changing destinies. It remained to be seen if they would be prepared to endure the fire that arises when truth confronts tradition. The afternoon was advancing in Jerusalem, bringing a dry heat that made the shadows stretch along the narrow alleys. Amid this setting, Noemi, Azarias, Eliab, and Abner were heading toward a less crowded part of the city, seeking refuge to reflect on their next steps. The tension had increased with the possibility of a public debate, and each carried, in addition to the collective dilemmas, personal challenges that were intensifying. Subplot 1. Noemi's call to heal past wounds. As the group approached a nearly deserted small courtyard, Noemi couldn't help but recall her own history and how her father's research had brought her closer to the sacred scrolls. He always said that the knowledge of God must lead to inner healing. Now faced with the possibility of disseminating such a transformative truth, her heart burned with a mixture of hope and fear. "Noemi, are you okay?" Eliab asked, noticing her worried expression. She forced a brief smile. "I'm just revisiting memories. My father dedicated his life to the Word, and yet he suffered opposition and misunderstanding. I fear walking the same path, and at the same time, I feel I need to honor his legacy by helping others discover that God speaks to the heart." Childhood memories came to mind. Afternoons copying verses alongside her father and trying to understand the subtext of millennia-old passages. Although the pain of family losses had never fully healed, the idea that a renewed mind could be a real channel for healing was becoming increasingly concrete. Perhaps all her suffering could be redeemed by leading others to find peace amid trials. Subplot 2. Azarias's inner battle. A few steps away, Azarias walked in silence, wearing a closed expression. The prospect of participating in a debate that could put him under public scrutiny was frightening. He had come from traumatic experiences on the battlefield. Now he felt he was entering a kind of spiritual war. He wondered if he had the strength to face it. At the same time, he noticed subtle changes in his own way of thinking. When war memories returned, he found himself capturing each negative thought, as he had learned in 2 Corinthians 10:5. Instead of sinking into despair, he tried to bring his mind to the promises of peace contained in the Scriptures. It seemed to work timidly but effectively. "Maybe there is something real in this mental renewal process," he whispered to himself. However, he feared that external pressure might make him regress. Like a soldier in dangerous terrain, Azarias needed to decide whether to embrace the faith that was blossoming or surrender to the panic that had kept him captive for so long. Pain and the possibility of healing clashed within his soul. Subplot 3. Eliab's intellectual conflict. Eliab felt he was at a crossroads. On one side, his love for traditions and rabbinic interpretations. On the other, the growing curiosity for this new dimension of intimacy with God. He had always been praised for his ability to memorize sacred texts, but now he realized that God's Word was not limited to theory. He had witnessed the presence of the Holy Spirit acting tangibly, illuminating minds and bringing comfort to troubled hearts. There is so much beauty in the letter of the law, he thought, but if the Creator himself leans to speak with each person, renewing them from within, then traditions should not be a barrier, but rather a springboard for living faith. Eliab feared losing the approval of his mentors, who might label him as deviating from strictly literal interpretations. But the desire to see people connected to God in a profound way ignited his heart. He felt torn between respecting the lineage of great masters and the attraction to a new level of relationship with the Almighty. Subplot 4. Abner's burden of mission. Abner, for his part, felt that his long search for ancient scrolls was converging on this moment. So many journeys, So many risky readings and even persecutions, and now, finally, he was on the brink of a public confrontation about a topic that could revolutionize the understanding of faith in the region. The question hammering his mind was, is this the ultimate purpose of my life's research? He also lived an internal dilemma. He had always been a solitary researcher, but now he found himself integrated into a group sharing the same ideal. Although he felt strengthened by this union, he feared that any mistake or exaggeration could cost everyone dearly, especially Naomi, Azarias, and Eliabe, who were still in the process of spiritual maturation. If it's to protect the purity of this message, I'm willing to face any challenge, he thought, recalling Jeremiah 29, where the prophet says that God's word is like fire in his bones, impossible to contain. At the same time, he felt the weight of being a guardian of knowledge on his shoulders, not an irresponsible arsonist. The crossroad of subplots. Converging at the same point, each individual's battles paralleled the overarching question: how to present such a powerful teaching to the public, the idea that God speaks to our minds and transforms us from within, without causing chaos or misunderstandings. The group arrived at a modest inner courtyard, surrounded by stone columns, where they decided to take a break. In this quiet place, they were able to release their anxieties, joining hands in a circle of prayer. Their voices were low, almost whispered, as if fearing to draw unwanted attention, and there in the center of all those concerns was God, offering a refuge of love and grace. Intersection with the mysteries of the manuscript. While praying, Eliab brought along a secondary scroll that Abner had given him moments earlier, containing fragments of Proverbs and anonymous reflections on divine wisdom. In the midst of reading, he came across a phrase that seemed to echo the group's dilemma. Perfect wisdom does not hide from the humble. Rather, it reveals itself to hearts that are willing to listen. The simple phrase brought an indescribable peace to everyone. There they understood that the key to dealing with opposition and their own fears lay in the humility to recognize that God is the one guiding the entire process. Divine wisdom is not a trophy for display, but a gift given to those who submit to His will. A step of faith. They then decided that they would not flee from public debate, but they would also not face it as a battlefield. Instead, it would be an opportunity to testify about the goodness of God and how the mind can be renewed in the light of the Scriptures. However, they agreed on something fundamental. If they acted out of pride or ostentation, they would fail. Only with the willingness to serve the divine purpose would they find the strength to face questions and criticisms. The harmony of this consensus eased some of the tensions, but did not completely dissipate them. Each subplot, Naomi's guilt, Azarias' traumas, Eliab's struggle between tradition and revelation, and Abner's mission as the guardian of this knowledge, remained open, requiring personal growth. And as the sun set, leaving the skies tinged with dramatic orange, everyone felt that the final stretch of this journey of faith was approaching rapidly. In the silent words that flowed through the courtyard, it was possible to hear an echo from the Creator's heart. Continue, for I am the one who began this good work in you, and I will carry it to completion. Philippians 1:6. Thus, hand in hand, they stood up, aware that the great trial by fire was approaching, uniting spiritual mysteries and the reality of each life. The dawn dissipated in the blink of an eye, and the rising sun bathed Jerusalem with a serene, almost prophetic light. That morning, the long-awaited debate would take place in a square near the temple, where renowned rabbis, scholars, pilgrims, and curious onlookers would gather to hear and question the revelations about the renewed mind. The atmosphere was bustling. Voices mingled with the beating of anxious hearts. For Naomi, Azarias, Eliab, and Abner, this would be the moment to put to the test everything they believed they had received from God. On the way to the debate, the group left the inn early, accompanied by Simeon. The stone streets filled with people heading in the same direction, some driven by curiosity, others by the desire to defend orthodoxy, and many by the hope of hearing something that would bring them meaning and renewal. As they walked, Naomi recalled a passage her father often cited. "Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute." Proverbs 31:8. She whispered to herself, "Maybe today we speak for those who have never known the beauty of an intimate communion with God." Azarias walked in silence, feeling a slight weight pressing on his shoulders. Since the previous night, He had been praying incessantly that his thoughts would not be dominated by old fears. He carried with him a fragment of parchment, with words of encouragement from Isaiah 26:3. You, Lord, will keep in perfect peace those whose minds are steadfast, because they trust in you. With each step, he mentally repeated this verse, almost like a shield against anxiety. Eliab, on the other hand, was reviewing in his mind the connections between the sacred texts that underpinned the renewal of the mind. He knew that he would inevitably face deep theological questions. Let God's will be done, not mine, he murmured, remembering how Jesus, centuries later, would teach to pray by surrendering his will to the Father. Even without yet knowing the writings of the New Testament, he felt in his spirit that the essence of the entire debate would be a struggle between human pride and the humility to listen to the divine voice. Abner tried to maintain his serenity, but knew he would be under critical scrutiny for bringing up the ancient manuscript. Part of him feared being held accountable if everything ended in turmoil. However, he believed that if the text truly spoke of a divine purpose, God himself would confirm the words before the authorities. Arrival at the location. Upon arriving at the square, they spotted a rustic table where some important rabbis were already gathered. There were stacks of parchment scrolls beside them, ready for consultation. The audience, in a semicircle, formed a small crowd in anticipation. Murmurs, whispers, and glances turned toward the group as they slowly advanced toward the designated central space for the debate. One of the rabbis, with a stern expression, raised his hand to indicate that the debate would begin. First, he made a long introduction about the importance of halakha, the set of laws and traditions, and the preservation of Moses' teachings. At a certain point, he issued a direct criticism. We have heard rumors of a new interpretation that supports the possibility of man hearing God directly in his mind, without the proper mediation of teachers or traditional sacrifices. This is dangerous, as it can lead to all kinds of deviations. We demand clarifications. The beginning of the confrontations. Simeon took a step forward and, with humility, presented himself as someone who honored traditions but also recognized the living action of the Spirit of God throughout the centuries. He emphasized that the scriptures were never limited to external rituals. On the contrary, since the prophets, God had invited the people to have a transformed heart and mind, Ezekiel 36:26, Jeremiah 31:33. The rabbis, however, seemed reluctant. Some grumbled among themselves. It was then that Eliab entered the conversation, reading aloud the passage that said, Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength. Deuteronomy 6:5. He argued that if one is to love God with the entirety of their being, this includes the mind. We are not proposing anything outside of the scriptures, but merely highlighting that mental renewal is part of a living relationship with the Most High, he defended, noticing expressions of surprise among part of the audience, questions, and resistances. The more traditional rabbis, however, insisted that this type of teaching could easily be distorted. One of them shouted, Who guarantees that this voice in the mind is from God and not some illusion or worse, an evil spirit? Since when do voices get heard outside traditional patterns? Are we not facing an attempt to break with rabbinic authority and spread chaos among the people? At that moment, Azarias felt his pulse quicken. If there was something he had learned in the past days, it was that the divine voice can always be confirmed by the scriptures themselves and by the loving and truthful character of the Eternal. With newly acquired courage, he raised his hand and, in a sober tone, reminded everyone of Deuteronomy 13:1-4, passages that warn about false prophets. The scriptures teach that we must test any message, including those that arise in our minds, to see if they align with the law and the character of God. We do not deny the importance of teachers or the established rituals, but we recognize that the Creator himself desires to engrave his law on our hearts. Wasn't this what Jeremiah prophesied? The response sparked diverse reactions. Some Pharisees fell silent, as they could not deny the legitimacy of the citation. In the background, murmurs from the crowd indicated that many were impressed by Azariah's frankness and were beginning to sympathize with the idea that God could indeed speak directly to their hearts. The most intense confrontation. Meanwhile, a more heated religious leader stood up, pointing an accusatory finger. You are subverting the order, claiming authority that none of you possess. Mental renewal is not a recognized doctrine. If you insist on this, You risk committing heresy against the law. A chill ran down Naomi's spine. Heresy was a strong word, and the punishment could be severe. Still, inspired by a conviction that overcame fear, she remembered the parchment her father had kept, and how the voice of God had brought her comfort amidst past pains. Calmly, she stepped forward. We respect every authority present here. However, is it really heresy to remember that God spoke to Abraham, Moses, Elijah, and many others, often using not only written laws, but also calling them by name, in the intimacy of the heart? If he is the same yesterday, today, and forever, why wouldn't he continue to speak to those who sincerely seek him? A heavy silence fell over the crowd. Eyes turned to the young woman, and for a moment it seemed her argument found undeniable echo in the collective memory of Israel, which knew accounts of patriarchs and prophets called directly by God. Decision and spiritual significance. The debate continued heatedly for a few more moments. However, the group's firm yet respectful stance, combined with the scriptural testimonies they presented, began to tip the scales in favor of at least considering what they were saying. Some more sensitive rabbis recognized that the emphasis on personal communion with God did not nullify tradition, but deepened it. After all the law and the prophets pointed to a genuine relationship with the Most High. In the end, a conclusion was reached. The Sanhedrin would need to deliberate on the matter, but for now they would not declare the teaching as heresy. The crowd, for its part, left the location divided. Some convinced they had heard a truth that offered them hope, others scandalized by the audacity of the speeches. Naomi, Azarias, Eliab, and Abner realized, however, that something greater had happened. They had planted seeds in the hearts, and that alone already held eternal value. While people dispersed, the four friends, along with Simeon, remained in the center of the square, absorbing the magnitude of what they had experienced. There was no official verdict that would absolve them from future criticism, but there was an unheard-of certainty that God had been present there. Some souls opened up to the possibility of having their hearts and minds shaped by the Creator. And in the great machinery of divine plans, each step toward genuine knowledge paved the way for the expansion of a living faith. The spiritual meaning of that confrontation. The announcement that it is not enough to respect external laws if the mind remains distant from God. On the contrary, the law of the Lord must be written internally, and the divine voice calls to be heard by willing hearts. Even amid tensions and uncertainties, it was as if heaven had whispered to all present, "Renew your mind in my presence, and I will show you wonders." The sun was already high over Jerusalem when the public debate came to an end, but the tension still lingered like a gentle veil in the city air. The square, once filled with spectators, was now gradually emptying. Rabbis and scholars were heading to their synagogues, carrying with them the unease and reflections awakened by the bold talks about the renewed mind. Among the people, some chatted excitedly, others frowned. The repercussions had gone beyond the borders of a simple religious debate, reaching the core of a nation's convictions accustomed to centuries of tradition. On the edge of the crowd, in the center of the square, remained Naomi, Azarias, Eliab, and Abner, accompanied by the faithful Simeon. There were no applause or cheers. On the contrary, the fatigue and the weight of what they had experienced were palpable. However, a subtle peace flooded each of them, as if by bravely facing that opposition, they had opened a portal to the divine movement that would transform not only their own lives, but also those of all who opened their hearts to God's call. "Do you think we went too far?" Naomi asked, a mix of relief and apprehension on her face. Azarias squeezed his new friend's hand, murmuring, "Maybe we have only just begun." The breath of decision. As they moved away from the site, a small group of people approached. They were anxious and curious faces who, despite fearing being seen in association with that new approach, couldn't resist the urge to learn more. An elderly man, with trembling steps, reported suffering for years from a mental illness that kept him from sleeping. A young woman, whose eyes bore deep marks of sadness, confessed to living oppressed by memories of abuse. A couple admitted to enduring intense marital conflicts, feeling trapped by destructive thoughts. "You said that God can transform our minds," the man with the weak voice interjected, "but how does that manifest in real life?" There, before that small crowd of the afflicted, the group understood that the real challenge did not end with the debate. They needed to demonstrate God's power practically, going beyond words. With tenderness, Simeon invited everyone to go to a nearby courtyard where they could talk without noise, the atrium of compassion. Gathered under the shade of an olive tree, Nomi and her friends listened to each person's stories, some filled with tears and pain. Gradually, they opened the scriptures, reinforcing the promise that God is close to the broken-hearted, Psalm 34:18, that He is capable of bringing healing where there has been abuse, that His peace can combat internal storms. With each biblical passage read, a new spark of hope seemed to ignite in the listener's eyes. Eliabe, feeling more secure now that he was not on a formal stage, spoke clearly about the renewal of the mind. He explained that it was not a magic formula, but a process, engaging with the truth of the Word, allowing the Holy Spirit to change our perspective. Azarias, moved, testified about his struggle against war traumas and how he was beginning to experience traces of peace through the practice of bringing every captive thought into obedience to God, 2 Corinthians 10:5. As people listened, compassion flowed like a balm in that place. There was no mystical spectacle, but a sincere manifestation of care, and above all, the divine presence that calmed hearts. Nomi's blooming for Nomi, this moment represented the pinnacle of her journey. She had always felt that her painful past and the lessons left by her father could bless others, but she didn't know how. Now she realized that the call to announce the possibility of a renewed mind was intertwined with her own story of restoration. "I understand the guilt, the longing, and the hopelessness," she said with each story of pain she heard, recalling her own difficult memories. "But there is a God who rewrites our crooked lines into a story of healing." With restrained tears, she realized that the same Spirit who had comforted her so many times now flowed through her words to reach other lives. Every testimony she received seemed to remind her, "Your pain was not in vain. I, the Lord, use everything for the good of those who love me." Romans 8:28. Abner's confirmation. Meanwhile, Abner, observing the scene, recalled all the scrolls and investigations he had undertaken over decades. He concluded in a simple and profound way that the greatest proof of the manuscript's truth about the renewed mind was not in heated theological debates, but in the fruit those words produced in real life. "All my research found its purpose here," he whispered, as he accompanied Simeon in guiding people on how to seek God in prayer and in the practice of mercy. Seeing the real change in faces and hearts confirms that no word from the Most High returns empty. The spiritual climax. In that discreet courtyard on the edge of official religious fervor, a sacred stillness settled. There were no performative miracles, but something much greater was happening. Hardened hearts found repentance, anxious minds received comfort, and hopeless lives perceived the possibility of a new beginning. Suddenly, an elderly lady with eyes clouded by age asked everyone to join in prayer. Noemi, Azarias, Eliabe, and Abner looked at each other, connected by a burning faith. Simeon led a simple and profound prayer, asking that God Himself breathe relief into the minds and restoration into the souls of those present. A gentle breeze blew, rustling the olive tree leaves, as if the Creator Himself were affirming the response that, yes, He hears the humble voice and grants grace to the afflicted. In a few moments, sobs of weeping mingled with smiles of gratitude. That place had transformed into a living sanctuary of the divine presence, evidencing that the message about the renewed mind was not theoretical, but experiential. The greater meaning, if the debate represented a great risk, and there would still be consequences for what was said. There in the courtyard, under the olive tree, they experienced the essence of everything. The renewal of the mind is not merely aimed at arguing doctrines, but at restoring people from the inside out. The climax of the journey was not just in winning ideological disputes, but in seeing lives touched by God's love, which manifests in the openness to hear His voice and allow Him to rewrite stories. When they rose from that joint prayer, the group's eyes met in an indescribable spiritual camaraderie. They walked together to the courtyard exit, exhausted but invigorated. Despite the opposition and all the uncertainties that would come, they knew that this was the most intense point of their journey, the living proof that God speaks, heals, and renews the mind and heart of those willing to believe. They would still have to face the authorities, possible sanctions, and gossip, but they had an unshakable conviction. The truth that enlightens the mind is also the truth that ignites the flame of hope in the heart. And in that flame, the future of each of them, and many who heard them, would no longer be the same. The culminating point, where mysteries are unveiled and spiritual lessons are revealed. The late afternoon sun gilded the streets of Jerusalem, marking the end of a day that had been intense for everyone. Amid the fatigue, Nomi, Azarias, Eliabe, Abner, and Simeon realized that something was still driving them forward. The debate in the public square had not only rekindled hopes among the afflicted, but also sparked the curiosity of many leaders and scholars. Rumors spread through the alleys and lanes. There was still one last fragment of the manuscript, unexplored, capable of consolidating the entire revelation about the renewed mind. In Abner's old notes, there was mention that an essential part of the text might be kept in a small underground chamber, not far from there. It was almost a legend, but given all they had witnessed, the group decided it was worth checking. Guided by a sense of mission and by Simeon's discreet guidance, who knew secret passages in the area, they ventured through the narrow slopes that led to the ancient cisterns beneath the city. The search for the lost fragment. As they descended the uneven stone steps, Eliab's torch illuminated damp walls inscribed with writings and symbols that dated back to bygone eras. The air was heavy, filled with an almost reverent silence. With each step, Nomi's heart beat faster, as if sensing that the definitive answer to her yearnings would be found in that hidden place. At a certain point in the underground corridor, they spotted a rustic, half-open door leading to a small chamber. There, on a kind of stone altar, lay an old chest. Around it, small remnants of burned candles indicated that a few knew of the room's existence and came there seeking something. "Be careful," Azarias whispered, senses on alert. He recalled how the greatest battles were not always visible. It was not just about physical defense, but about a spiritual atmosphere he felt hovering in the environment. Carefully, Abner knelt before the chest. His hands trembled, for he was finally facing what he had suspected for years. He forced the rusty lock open, and with a creak, the lid swung open. Inside, a small wooden box housed a yellowed parchment, sealed with an ancient wax emblem, the ancient seal and the revelation. Before breaking the seal, Abner raised his gaze to his companions. "If this is truly the fragment that completes the text, then we will understand the entirety of the promise regarding the renewal of the mind. But be prepared. Sometimes, the ultimate truth requires more surrender than we imagine." Simeon's voice resonated in the silent chamber. "There is no reason to fear. The same God who has guided us here will illuminate the next words." Thus, Abner broke the seal and unrolled the manuscript. In the center of the parchment were characters in classical Hebrew, and just below small glyphs similar to those they had decoded earlier. With the help of Eliabe and Noemi, he read aloud, "In the contrite heart, the Eternal imprints his law. In the submissive mind, he speaks softly. He who listens and obeys will know true peace, and peace will guide him to become a light among the nations." Everyone felt a shiver. It was as if those words connected all the loose ends of their previous studies, confirming that the renewal of the mind is not limited to an individual benefit, but enables a person to be a divine instrument in society. The text continued, "Do not fear the darkness, for where the mind is in harmony with the Word, the presence of the Most High shines forth. The man who lives this truth transforms destinies, for he ceases to walk according to the flesh and begins to walk according to the Spirit." The chamber seemed to be filled with a gentle breeze, although there were no windows or air vents. It was a sign that God was sealing there the last and deepest layer of understanding. The renewed mind not only listens to God, but also echoes his love and goodness in the world. The invisible confrontation. At that moment, a shadow appeared at the entrance of the chamber. A man with stern features, likely connected to the group of religious individuals who feared these discoveries, shouted, "You should not be here. This knowledge does not belong to you and may bring more disturbance than blessing. Close that chest and leave, or I will be forced to call others to prevent this violation." Tension grew. Still holding the parchment, Abner slowly stood up. Azarias prepared for the possibility of a physical confrontation, but Simeon intervened with serene authority. "This place does not belong to us, and indeed, we do not belong to it. But the words enclosed here are not the property of a caste. They are the living testimony of the Most High God for anyone who wishes to open their heart." Nomi, driven by a sense of divine justice, stepped forward. We do not intend to subvert anything. We are fulfilling what the Scriptures teach us, to seek with all our heart the presence and voice of God. If this is wrong in the eyes of men, then we submit our cause to the Lord, who examines minds and hearts. Surprised by their tranquility, the man hesitated. He seemed to expect resistance, fear, or violence, but was met only with firmness and compassion. The look in his eyes wavered, as if he sensed something deeper at work there. He took a step back, unsure of how to react. The outcome of the conflict. The atmosphere was thick, but suddenly an even greater peace enveloped the environment. As if the very word read in that manuscript conferred an invisible authority, the man bowed his head and simply withdrew, muttering something inaudible. Only the group and the newly revealed words remained. Carefully, Abner placed the parchment in his leather bag, certain that they would need to share it with those who were truly seeking the truth. Simeon in turn offered a prayer of gratitude. It was not an ending with loud triumphs, but a silent and transformative climax. For the greatest power, there was the certainty that God not only speaks, but also moves hearts. The seed of the future. They left the underground chamber carrying not only the parchment, but also a renewed sense of mission. Naomi remembered those she had met in the courtyard, the pains she had witnessed, and wished to bring the comfort of the renewed mind to each of them. Azarias, increasingly freeing himself from his traumas, promised himself to help other soldiers, and war victims find relief in thoughts consolidated by the word. Eliabe, warmed by the reconciliation between tradition and revelation, saw in it the chance to unite generations around the same living God. Abner, finally, felt that he was crowning his decades of research by confirming the transformative reality of the Scriptures, and remained steadfast in protecting that knowledge from misuse. At that very moment, Jerusalem stretched before them under the sunset, as if the city breathed hope. The climax was not a physical battle nor a dramatic spectacle, but the quiet victory of the truth. God indeed desires to renew the minds of his children and imprint his law upon them, making them bearers of light in the midst of darkness. It was the culmination of the entire quest, and at the same time the beginning of a new era for each one and for all who accepted this message of faith and restoration. Tie up the characters' arcs and reflect on spiritual lessons, encouraging the audience to deepen their knowledge. The next morning, sun found Naomi, Azarias, Eliabe, and Abner walking through the cobblestone streets of Old Jerusalem once again. On each of their faces was a calm yet determined expression. The climax they experienced in the underground chamber, finding the last fragment of the manuscript and confronting the fears surrounding it, had irreversibly marked their souls. Now it was time for each to follow their path, applying the lessons learned and offering the world the fruits of their experiences. Naomi's arc. Healing and compassion. For Naomi, the journey was above all about healing. She no longer allowed herself to be dominated by family traumas or the guilt that had pursued her for so long. Discovering that God not only speaks through the Scriptures, but also desires to rewrite the confusing lines of the past, brought her serene joy. My father always believed that sincere study of the Word leads to transformative knowledge, she commented, watching the movement of people. Now I feel that I honor his legacy by helping those who suffer find the same comfort I discovered. She bid farewell to her companions with a tight embrace, recalling the dozens of people who, in debates and in the courtyard, opened their hearts to the message of the renewed mind. Naomi decided she would return to writing and guiding vulnerable individuals so that they would realize that God calls them individually to a sincere and liberating communion. Azarias' arc. Hope and reconciliation. Azarias, in turn, departed with the conviction that God was gradually healing his inner wounds. Throughout his life, he had felt unworthy of peace because of memories of war and violence. However, experiencing the process of mental renewal showed him that divine grace is greater than the marks of the past. Every time a dark thought tries to bring me down, I remember that God called me to peace, he confessed. And now I want to bring hope to those who suffer from the same affliction. He believed he could be a counselor and friend to traumatized soldiers and families affected by the brutality of conflicts. To the world, he might seem like an ordinary ex-combatant, but deep inside, Azarias knew that God was transforming him into an instrument of reconciliation. Eliabe's arc, tradition and revelation in harmony. Eliabe, on the other hand, found in the manuscript and the entire experience a bridge between the tradition he so loved and the renewal that the Spirit of God operates in the heart. He discovered that he did not need to deny the laws and customs to embrace a living communion with the Most High. He could indeed deepen his understanding of every word of the law, illuminating it with the perspective of the transformed mind. "I want to show my former teachers that renewal does not contradict the Scriptures," he declared, his eyes shining. "It reveals the essence of the law, to love God with all our understanding, strength, soul, and thoughts." Now Eliab planned to travel through villages, sharing his discoveries with disciples, seeking to learn more about the direct relationship between God and the human mind. He dreamed of creating spaces for study and prayer, where tradition and revelation could unite, generating genuine life and spirituality. Abner's Ark, the guardian of knowledge. As for Abner, the old feeling of walking alone gave way to peace in being part of a spiritual family. He chose to protect those manuscripts, not to imprison the knowledge, but to share it with prudence and love. He decided to remain in Jerusalem for a time, alongside Simeon, compiling all the parchments and notes to form a secure archive. "Many will use this truth to heal and liberate," he pondered, "but some may try to distort or manipulate it. We need to stay vigilant and teach responsibly, always in the light of the Scriptures." Such a mission filled him with meaning. After all, he had spent his life researching texts and legends, and now he had found proof that knowledge without love and practice is worthless. He concluded that being a guardian was not about holding power, but serving the divine purpose of more people discovering the path of a mind anchored in God. Simeon's final reflection. Simeon, watching each of them set off for their new areas of work, felt his heart lighten. Not everyone accepted the message, and opposition would likely still arise strongly, but the Master, experienced as he was, knew that the seeds had been sown. In his heart, he prayed that each would remain steadfast in humility and love, for that was the true testimony of those whose minds are guided by God. "You carry the torch of a truth that, in essence, has existed since the creation of the world," he said, with a serene smile. "With each step, remember, not by might nor by power, but by my Spirit." Zechariah 4-6. Spiritual lessons and call to action. Thus concluded the story. However, like every encounter with the sacred, nothing truly ended. It only opened a new chapter. The fundamental lesson learned by each character, and by all who witnessed, is that God desires to speak with us in our innermost being, guiding our thoughts and emotions so that we may be restored and become instruments of healing in the world. The renewal of the mind, therefore, is not an abstract concept but an experience that requires daily surrender. It is the message of Romans 12:2. "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind," presenting us with an invitation to review our beliefs, values, and attitudes, aligning everything with the eternal principles of the Most High. May the story of these pilgrims also inspire you, who have followed it this far. What are the thoughts that bind your mind to fear, guilt, or hopelessness? The Word of God calls for a profound transformation, bringing liberation and purpose. Subscribe to this channel and leave your comment, telling us how this narrative touched your heart. You can also share your own experiences of renewal and overcoming. Delve deeper. If you wish, read and meditate on passages such as Romans 12:2, 2 Corinthians 10:5, and Psalm 139. Reflect on how God desires to shape your thoughts and reveal to you plans of peace and hope. Spread the word. If you know someone who needs hope or is facing dilemmas of faith, send this video or story as a form of encouragement. The same God who spoke to the hearts of Naomi, Azariah, Eliab, and Abner remains active today, ready to renew minds and transform destinies. Thus we conclude this journey, but with the certainty that its true impact will still flourish in the lives of each one who decides to walk the path of opening their mind and heart to the divine voice. May you, in your own story, also experience the power of God renewing every thought and leading you to a new understanding of faith, life, and the infinite love that comes from above.